In the beginning. Well, the beginning of this story, anyway. Amaterasu, the goddess of the sun, was born when the creator deity Izanagi went to bathe in the waters of the Tachibana River. He had been defiled by his visit to Yomi, the underworld of death, in a vain attempt to bring his beloved Izanami back to life, and his spirit was sorely in need of cleansing. As he washed his face, the sun, Amaterasu, streamed from his left eye, the moon, Tsukuyomi, from his right eye, and out of his nose came the youngest and only son among the three precious children, Susanoo, a wild and mischievous boy who could not have been more different from his two elder sisters. Susanoo caused so much trouble, in fact, that he was ultimately banished from the celestial realm, but not before his behavior had so mortified and offended Amaterasu that she shut herself up in a cave, depriving both heaven and earth of her light. To convince her to return, the other gods danced and laughed, throwing a grand celebration, and their merriment finally convinced Amaterasu to peek out of her cave for just a moment to see what was going on. When she did, she caught sight of her own brilliance reflected in a mirror, and was so dazzled that the other gods were finally able to bring her out and restore sunlight to the world. That mirror, Yata no Kagami, went on to become one of the three sacred treasures of the Japanese royal family, serving as a constant reminder of the benevolent sun which shines light on all that lives, from the most exalted spirit to the lowliest creeping plant. Such as this one, the Mitsumata bush, which has been used since the 7th century AD in Japan to make paper. Japanese people have always loved making things out of wood, as well as making things out of things made out of wood, with paper being a particularly favored material. In Japan, paper has never been just for writing or painting on. There are paper screens, lacquered paper boxes, paper walls, and even paper sculpture in the form of origami, which in a uniquely Japanese way combines austerity and whimsy in a single fragile work of art. Which is not to say that the Japanese never cared about writing or painting, because they obviously did. In fact, because so much of their furniture was deliberately simple and easy to move, in many rooms of a house the most prominent decoration would consist of paintings and calligraphy displayed on hanging scrolls, or screens and walls illustrated with scenes in either the Chinese or Japanese style. Without paper and ink, any time spent in a traditional Japanese building would be pretty uncomfortable. It would be cold, because paper was their insulation. Lacking in privacy, because paper was how they partitioned interior space. And most of all, it would be dull, because apart from the occasional vase or statue, there'd be nothing to look at. Well, nothing to look at inside, anyway. But if your room happened to have a window, you could certainly look outside and possibly see one of the most beautiful landscapes in all of Asia. Japan is blessed with a vibrant and picturesque natural environment, and the country has captivated artists for that reason since the first brush was put to paper here. Apart from the topographic landscape of mountains, rivers, and plains, what really makes the landscape of Japan special is its wildlife. With a climate ranging from subtropical in the south to nearly subarctic in the north, it's full of little pockets of natural diversity, places that are unique both in Japan and in the world. 3,000 species of fish swim in its rivers and seashores. Huge flocks of migratory birds pass through it every year. Large mammals range from badgers, wildcats, and monkeys to bears, boars, and the famous tanuki, or raccoon dog. But one otherwise common mammal you won't find here is the wolf, and there's a story behind that fact too. You see, there was once a subspecies of gray wolf native to Japan, and for many centuries wolves were revered by Japanese peasants because they would hunt the boars and deer which did so much damage to their crops. Since Japan has never been a particularly pastoral culture, with few families owning domestic livestock like sheep or cattle, wolves were never as hated here as they generally were in medieval Europe. But all that changed with the Meiji Restoration in 1868. Japan, which had been a closed-off, insular society for centuries, was suddenly trading and communicating with the whole rest of the civilized world, and the Meiji Emperor was eager to adopt modern European technology, along with the social customs that accompanied it. One of the ways in which Japanese culture changed in the late 19th century was that people started to eat more meat, especially the wealthy, and so for the first time great herds of cattle appeared, a natural target for depredation by packs of wolves. At the same time, a decline in the populations of boars and deer made it difficult for wolves to survive without poaching cattle, while also relieving farmers of the threat which had made them welcome the wolves to begin with. Over the next several decades, the Japanese wolf's status was cut down from noble protector to thieving pest, and the authorities made it official policy to kill every wolf on sight. Like Mao Zedong's sparrow-killing edict of the late 1950s in China, this policy was, if anything, far too successful. By 1905, the Japanese wolf had been driven to extinction. So you might be wondering at this point what these three anecdotes have to do with each other, let alone video games. Well, it just so happens that gods, paper, and wolves are all concepts represented by the Japanese word kami. The word on its own has several other meanings as well, including hair, but in the form Ōkami, with O being a Japanese prefix that means great, it specifically refers to the now extinct Japanese wolf. And all three of these concepts are essential, I might even say central, to the overall design and attitude of one of my favorite games of all time, the epic action-adventure, kinda Zelda-like, published by Capcom in 2006, known simply as Ōkami! The simplest of our three kami is this one, meaning paper. As I said before, paper was once ubiquitous in Japanese life, both as a writing medium and as a building material, and it still makes its presence felt in Japan more than almost anywhere else in the world, particularly in festive or religious contexts. Washi, the traditional Japanese paper made from native plants like the Mitsumata bush, was intentionally thicker and more durable than most of the paper used in the West. And because taking care of the things you use is practically a religion in parts of the country, something like a paper lantern or a screen might be passed down through several generations, like a treasured piece of family furniture. As recently as a few years ago, the BBC was reporting on Japan's uncertainty over giving up older, paper-oriented forms of payment and record-keeping in favor of virtualization. Japanese people like cash and hand-signed documents. Not that they actually sign them, they use a personal seal instead, but that's a whole other video. When they give their children a special allowance on New Year's Day, it comes as paper money inside a fancy paper envelope. When business people meet each other, they want to have a card to hand out, not because there isn't a better way to tell people about yourself, but because it's a comforting ritual involving a real object that you can see and handle. And for a similar reason, when they make contracts, they like to know that there's a piece of paper somewhere that won't be easy to tamper with, something to keep the terms of the agreement set in stone. Well, paper, but you get the point. Unlike in the West, where metaphors involving paper generally have to do with things being flimsy or fake, paper millionaire, house of cards, paper-thin excuse, etc. In Japan, something being written down on paper is what makes it properly real, because it's been recorded. In a metaphysical sense, it's been introduced into the world of things from its original hazy existence as an idea. One of the central tenets of Buddhism is that everything is impermanent, but if there's one thing that's at least a little more lasting than a handshake and a promise, it's words or images that have been put on paper. And this gives the visual presentation of Ōkami a curious affinity with both traditional and modern Japanese culture, because it's a video game, a completely virtual experience that's designed to look and feel like a drawing made with paper, ink, and pigments, and it pulls out a lot of stops to sell this illusion. At the most basic level, Ōkami imitates art by incorporating the conventional framing elements of Eastern artworks into its visuals. The introductory cutscene begins with an ink-dipped brush painting the outlines of a scene between two decorative borders that resemble the edges of a scroll, which take the place of the usual cinematic black bars, and these borders appear in every cutscene that follows. The game's menus appear as scrolls, so do dialogue boxes and character portraits. And when you use the game's trademark celestial brush system, the entire screen zooms out and tilts slightly to make it look like a scroll lying on a writing desk, complete with the decorative borders and an ink pot as well. And one particularly subtle touch is that whenever you use the celestial brush to do anything, kanji appear inside a rectangular border on parts of the screen, as if the world is being stamped like a painting or an official decree. In fact, words are some of Ōkami's most common decorative touches. Kanji with either a literal or a metaphorical significance appear on the walls during combat sections, flowing out of evil or cursed objects, and often on the faces or bodies of enemies. As unusual as this can seem sometimes, it makes a lot more sense when you remember that this game is based on traditional Japanese art, in which calligraphy and poetry were considered essential elements. Although artists often confined the words to a corner, or put them in a box to separate them from the rest of the picture, they could hardly imagine doing without them completely. Unlike in Western art, images were never expected to stand alone and speak for themselves in the paintings which inspired Ōkami's art style. But of course, there's more to that art style than the framing devices we've just discussed. More than anything else, it's the technique of representing backgrounds and objects that gives Ōkami its distinctive artsiness. In a very basic sense, you could describe the game's graphics as cel-shaded, but that might mislead a casual listener into thinking that it looks like The Wind Waker or Jet Set Radio, when it really looks quite different. Like those games, Ōkami uses bright, vibrant colors with relatively little shading or use of gradients. But when you look at something as fundamental as the outlines, you can see a pretty big gulf between them. Wind Waker's outlines are quite subtle, especially out in the open sea, where background objects often seem to blur into each other. Jet Set Radio's are more exaggerated, in keeping with its graffiti-ish sensibilities, but I would still describe them as essentially restrained and realistic, even though the color choices are far from that. By contrast, Ōkami's outlines are, to put it mildly, prominent. Many of them are so thick that when viewed from certain angles, they appear to radiate out from the objects they set off and take up actual physical space. This approach to outlining objects is so idiosyncratic that I don't think I've ever seen another video game come anywhere close to it. And admittedly, that does make it kind of jarring sometimes, but it can also have a kind of reverse uncanny valley effect, where it's so obviously artificial that it actually starts to feel soothing. These giant outlines are just the most obvious expression of an unwritten rule that informs Ōkami's whole aesthetic approach. Wherever possible, replace a realistic-looking visual element with a picturesque, stylized equivalent representing the same thing. In Ōkami, the dust which you kick up as you run doesn't form hazy, indistinct clouds. It comes in individual, roughly circular puffs that almost look like flowers. Waves aren't complex sinusoidal patterns that break up into sea foam when they hit the shore. They're just curvy bands of pure white that vanish completely as they hit the shore. Wind isn't a mostly invisible force that can only be detected by how it moves things around. It's visible lines that float through the air, sometimes looping or forming a spiral as they go. Fire isn't, well, one of the hardest things on Earth to draw, as I know from personal experience. It's a bunch of flat, squiggly, reddish shapes that hop up and down. I could go on, but I think you get the point. Despite its beauty and richness of detail, Ōkami doesn't make any attempt to look realistic. Instead, it portrays the world the way ukiyo-e artists portrayed it, as something more colorful, smoother, and simpler than it really is. But Ōkami also does something that most ukiyo-e artists didn't. They drew landscapes, portraits of famous people, and genre scenes from literature and folktales because these were conventional, popular subjects, and they employed the style they did because it matched the artistic mores of the time. It was what people expected, painterly enough to be attractive, while also being realistic enough to convey recognizable images that meant something to the viewer. But despite the abundance of words in Japanese paintings, these words were rarely used to tell an original story. Even in the scenes taken from folktales, like Hokusai's series of prints based on classic ghost stories, the focus was on illustrating one key scene from each tale, not using a progression of images to convey a sense of dynamic plot development. These artists could conjure up beautiful, striking images of the floating world which passed before them, but only for a single frozen instant. Ōkami's ambitions were much loftier than this. Not only does it have an original story, which incorporates many other earlier folktales in much the same way as Stephen Sondheim's musical Into the Woods, but it's also, a game, with gameplay designed to make you feel like you're helping to tell that story. Its creators straddled the line between ancient and modern, hoping that the result would be something timeless, but well aware that even successful video games naturally tend to have a short shelf life. Ahem. They were essentially trying to recreate, from scratch, a sense of taste that hadn't existed for more than a century, and make it fun at the same time, which is something its predecessors never had to worry about. I consider it to be practically a miracle that, despite a few snags here and there, they generally managed to pull this off and make everything work together harmoniously. Which brings us to the second of the three ideas which made Ōkami the masterpiece that it is. Our second meaning of kami is actually the one most commonly associated with the word, referring to the countless forces, at once natural and supernatural, which permeate the world according to Japan's traditional religion, generally known as Shinto. Shinto basically constitutes the sum of all the religious and mystical beliefs that Japanese society had before various strains of Buddhism, and later modern secular culture, began to take their place. It's not a very demanding or dogmatic faith, and as such it accommodates itself quite easily to other religious beliefs, and arguably even atheism, which is probably why so many aspects of it have survived into the modern day, albeit mostly in the form of festivals and superstitions. The simplest English translation of kami would be the word gods, but this would give a misleading impression of its meaning. God is a little too portentous a word for a thing that, to the ancient Japanese mind, came in all shapes and sizes, as well as different levels of importance. The Japanese believed that kami were everywhere, and that anything could be a kami, and the proper attitude to have toward them wasn't necessarily worship, which implies a certain sense of fear and obedience, but more a feeling of respect, or even sympathy. Whenever something special or unusual happened, whether fortunate or unfortunate, it was usually attributed to the presence of Ōkami, generally one that could be pleased or at least mollified by doing something special for them. The rice grew really tall this year? Oh yeah, that's probably Inari, the fox kami. He's usually pretty friendly, so let's have a big celebration and offer up some rice. Now what the hell, make it sake. This has been a really good year. But if there was a natural disaster, like an earthquake, uh-oh, that's probably a kami that lives on the mountain. I told them to stop gathering chestnuts up there. Okay, time to break out the big guns. Who's got some fireworks? Those should make it happy. Or scare it off, I don't know, one or the other. And it could also be something as simple as, that rabbit sure is looking at you in a funny way. Kind of an intense stare. I guess that might be a kami. Why don't you feed it some radish slices and pet it a little, just in case? Being magical isn't such a big deal in a country where people think it's magical when your house doesn't fall down and wild boars don't eat all your food. Ōkami takes place in a fictionalized version of Japan called Nippon, so it should come as no surprise that spirits, both good and evil, big and small, abound in its story. The protagonist, Amaterasu, the White Wolf, is essentially a kami, as are the 12 keepers of celestial brush techniques that she encounters over the course of the game. She possessed all these abilities a century earlier, when she perished trying to protect the people of Kamiki Village from a dreadful 8-headed dragon named Orochi. But on her death, the various celestial brush gods went into hiding and took their techniques with them, all except her most essential ability, which is literally to make the sun rise. The human hero Nagi, who fought alongside Amaterasu, was ultimately able to defeat Orochi, and with his magical sword Tsukuyomi, he sealed the beast's power away in a cave on the edge of a nearby lake. He and the rest of the villagers went on to live peaceful and prosperous lives, but as the curtain opens on Ōkami's story, some idiot wanders into the moon cave where Orochi is sealed and breaks the protective barrier by removing the sword. In doing so, he not only allows Orochi to be revived, but also unleashes a ghastly curse that extends over nearly the entire country. At first, only a small corner of Kamiki Village itself is spared from the curse, thanks to the protection of its own guardian kami, the tree sprite Sakuya, who uses the last of her power to cast a spell bringing Amaterasu back to life. Together with a tiny, loudmouthed braggart named Issen, who survived the curse by hiding inside Sakuya's, sphere of influence, Amaterasu embarks on her mission to save the village, restore her powers, subdue Orochi, and purge the evil which he represents once and for all. By the end of the game, this goal has become a lot more complicated, and the backstory gets downright weird. But my goal here isn't to spoil Ōkami's entire story. So let's just start off with the basics and see how far that takes us. As in most stories about mythological heroes, a lot of Ōkami is taken up with the hero rescuing others from situations ranging from the distressing to the life-threatening. But what distinguishes it is the unique way in which this help is given. One of the most common things that happens is that Amaterasu will stumble across someone who's in trouble, and through divine intervention will manage to solve their problems, often making it seem as though they did it on their own, or through an unexpected stroke of good fortune. The first time this happens is when she nudges Susanoo, Nagi's lazy and self-doubting descendant, into trying to move a boulder which has cut Kamiki Village off from the nearby Shinshu fields. The scene begins with him taking a nap in the middle of the day, but when Amaterasu brings him some sake brewed by Kushi, the girl who he's in love with, he musters up the will to do some sword training. Amaterasu sits behind him and uses her power slash technique to rip his training dummies to shreds in time with his strokes, which convinces him that he's somehow gained enormous power. Suddenly excited, he rushes up to the boulder and cuts at it ferociously, which, along with another power slash from Amaterasu, cleaves it right in half. This is a very well-paced, dramatic, and funny scene, but what I like most about it is the parallelism between the divine actions of Amaterasu and the mundane ones performed by Susanoo. As a player, you're capable of slashing at the training dummies yourself and getting the same result as in the cutscene, but the boulder is impervious to a normal power slash. You might think this is a simple inconsistency, like, oh, of course this doesn't work until the game wants me to do it. But that would be a very uncharitable way of looking at things. The point is that Susanoo participated in the magic. By getting him involved, Amaterasu gave his ordinary sword swipes a power that was stronger than anything he or she could do on their own, and later they team up to do exactly the same thing to Orochi, which settles his hash for good. It's kind of like that scene in Who Framed Roger Rabbit, where Roger slips his hands out of the handcuffs while Eddie Valiant is trying to saw them open, and Eddie stares at him and says, "You mean to tell me you could have done that at any time?" And Roger responds, "Oh no, not at any time, only when it was funny." Roger Rabbit can do a lot of amazing things, and at several points the plot hangs on him being able to do them. But at his core, he's a comedian who exists to make people laugh. And if he's going to be a hero, that's the only way he can do it. Something that Eddie is picked up on by the end, when he defeats the bad guys by taking a page from Roger's book and paralyzing them with laughter. In the same way, because Amaterasu is Ōkami, despite her benevolence and power, she can't literally solve other people's problems without their involvement. They have to make some kind of effort, no matter how small it may be, which she can then invest her own powers into and turn into a solution. Perhaps even more importantly, they have to believe in her as well, which isn't easy because most people can't see the marks of her divinity. To most people, Amaterasu just looks like a white wolf. Admittedly, not the kind of thing you see every day, but not something obviously magical either. However, because her actions are so decisive in helping good to triumph, most of the humans that Amaterasu interacts with do end up believing that someone was watching over and assisting them, even when they don't realize that she's the one doing it. This is more than a basic story hook. It has roots that stretch deeply into the gameplay of Ōkami. This is a game where you increase your stats and gain new abilities not by fighting monsters, but by helping people and exploring the world that you're protecting. Upgrades to your health, ink level, the astral pouch, basically a one-up system, and wallet come from spending praise, which is exactly what it sounds like, feelings of gratitude from the countless living things upon which you've bestowed your heavenly mercies. Most of the side quests in Ōkami give you some praise on top of whatever other rewards you get, and there are certain plot-critical actions that give you praise as well. But the two most frequent activities that give you praise are about as basic as it gets: feeding animals and making plants grow. To feed a group of animals, all you have to do is approach it with a feed bag of the appropriate kind in your inventory. Birds eat seeds, bears eat fish, monkeys eat, well, anything. You get the picture. Pressing the feed button will open your menu to select the feed bag, and when you do, it begins this frankly adorable cutscene that shows the animal tucking into whatever it is you brought. This cutscene is stupidly simple, but it goes on for a long time if you don't skip it. More than a minute, in fact, with the camera just slowly rotating around Amaterasu and an animal enjoying its food against this background of flowery meadows and cherry blossoms. This is another one of those things which may seem overindulgent if you're not into Ōkami's aesthetic, but if you are, then it's quite a zen vibe. It reinforces the idea that this is a special moment, an experience that costs the player almost nothing, but which means a great deal to the animal being fed. A lot of Japanese people absolutely love this feeling. There's a park in Nara called, wait for it, Nara Park, where the main attraction is buying crackers to feed to the 1,000+ wild deer that live there. These deer were once considered sacred, but now they're appreciated just for being what they are, a vestige of the beautiful wilderness that was once all around, but which now retreats farther and farther into the periphery of most people's lives every year. This love, not just of living things, but of wild things, specifically, may also have something to do with the prominence of flowers and trees in Ōkami. Now, Japanese people did invent bonsai, which is about the most control-freakish thing I've ever seen in my life, but they also have an appreciation for plant life in its natural state. In Ōkami, there are plants all over the place, including evil ones, and some of them, like Sakuya's guardian saplings, are pretty important to the plot and determine the pacing of certain areas, since these places are cursed and large portions of them are cut off until you find the tree and revitalize it, triggering a cutscene of the area being freed from the curse in what the game officially calls a Great Divine Intervention. Yes, the most powerful purifying spell in the entire game only happens when you heal a magic tree. Ōkami is so freaking zen it hurts. But this is also a world full of smaller, humbler plants. Cherry trees with ribbons tied around them, clovers that pop out when you dig in special spots, strange alien-looking bulbs in the forest with treasures inside, and of course the trail of grass and wildflowers that springs up under Amaterasu's feet when she begins to sprint. I mentioned earlier that one of my favorite things about Ōkami's story is the parallels it draws between the big, world-shaking effects of cosmic forces battling to the death and the little undramatic struggles that make up everyday life for us ordinary mortals. This connection between Amaterasu's existence as a god dealing with other gods, and her life as an animal dealing with other animals, including people, is another noteworthy kind of parallelism, and it makes the game feel a lot more relatable and fun than it would if the plot was just constant big league melodrama. Believers in Shinto may have thought that some animals were kami, but they didn't think that they were any less animals for all that, and Amaterasu is the same. She's a goddess, but at the same time she's also very clearly a wolf. She likes to sleep. She likes to snap her jaws at stuff, especially Issen when he's being a little buttface. She likes it when people pet her, and she likes to give a mighty roar whenever she defeats a particularly tough monster. The strongest connection that Ōkami has with the traditional culture of Japan, and with the Zen school of Buddhism that grew up there, is its conveyance of the idea that the spiritual aspects of life are omnipresent in the experience of everyday life. Battles between good and evil don't play out only on a cosmic scale, between divine entities with world-shattering superpowers. Making a single flower grow, or feeding a hungry animal, counts as a triumph of good over evil. And Amaterasu, who's constantly involved in struggles both great and small to make the world a better place, is the perfect symbol for this attitude in both a mechanical and a narrative sense. But there are downsides to Ōkami's overall approach, particularly for a studio that wants its game to be a financial success. And most of these also have to do with what Amaterasu fundamentally is. Not just an illustration, not just a kami, but more than anything else, a lone wolf. Let's be frank here for a moment. This whole idea of Ōkami's title having 3 equally valid meanings is basically a gimmick that I came up with to make this video a little more coherent than it would have been otherwise. Yes, technically you could refer to the Japanese goddess of the sun as Amaterasu Ōkami, which is mentioned on as revered a source of information as Wikipedia. But this is far from a common title, and the usage would not be familiar to a Japanese audience. What the word Ōkami means in Japanese, literally, is wolf. Nothing more, nothing less. And it wouldn't be exactly correct to call it a pun either, any more than the fact that we call a certain type of insect a butterfly is a pun. It's figurative language, certainly, but the word is so firmly established in English that we don't think of a butterfly as having anything to do with butter. And the same is true for the word Ōkami in Japanese. So what do Japanese people think of wolves today? Well, the truth is that they don't really think of them at all. The oldest Japanese person in the world was born 3 years after the Japanese wolf went extinct. Except in artistic contexts, no Japanese person alive today has ever seen the kind of wolf that the word Ōkami refers to, so they wouldn't know what to think about it as a real animal, just as an English knight in the 15th century wouldn't really know what a lion was like, apart from its existence as a heraldic symbol of authority. That's not to say that Japanese people don't have any mental associations with wolves, because they do have those artistic depictions and the language that accompanies them. There's even a phrase in Japanese, Ippiki Ōkami, which corresponds almost exactly to the English term lone wolf. That is, a person who lives and acts alone, in defiance of social expectations or rules. If you know anything about Japanese social mores, I hardly need to explain to you that this is not a positive term. Lone wolves tend to be associated with crime, delusional thinking, and terrorism, not to mention the much-discussed phenomenon of hikikomori, which refers to people, usually young men, who shut themselves up in their rooms and refuse to come out for any reason, sometimes for years at a time. In a highly organized society built around networks of social relationships, people like this are not appreciated for being different. Instead, they're feared and despised. It's not for nothing that Japanese is the language which gave us the expression, "the nail that sticks out is the one that gets hammered down." Back before the juggernaut that was the Meiji Restoration, the culture of Japan was generally more tolerant of individual eccentricities than what we imagine, and individualism is also back on the rise today. But the pressures of conformity and the emotional need to please others by not disrupting social harmony are still more powerful there than almost anywhere else in the world. Ōkami's own story is full of this kind of conflict, and the author's opinion generally comes down on the side of the community. Characters like Susanoo, Oki, who literally transforms into a wolf, and even the co-protagonist Issen represent a rejection of duty and social expectations, and all three are ultimately forced by circumstances to rise above their own selfish impulses and do the difficult things that are expected of them in order to help save Nippon. This is not a story that promotes doing your own thing, regardless of the cost to the people around you. Which is a bit ironic, because the creators of Ōkami were very much doing their own thing when they designed it, and the result was not something calculated to appeal to contemporary Japanese tastes, which it didn't, if sales figures are anything to go by. To understand why this game made such a poor financial showing, you have to understand the context in which it was originally released. Ōkami was published in 2006 by Capcom, whose biggest franchises were Street Fighter, Mega Man, Resident Evil, and Devil May Cry. These series share a few key points in common. They're all gameplay-driven, they take place in futuristic or foreign settings, sometimes both, and their stories tend to be schlocky and melodramatic, like a comic book rather than, say, a novel. Capcom was known for simple fun, without a distracting emphasis on storytelling. If anything, the big story studio back then was Konami, their main rival, responsible for such talk-your-ear-off franchises as Metal Gear Solid and Silent Hill. Not only is Ōkami completely unlike a typical hit Capcom game, it's also pretty different from the kind of game that fans of director Hideki Kamiya would have expected. Kamiya was famous for one thing back in the mid-2000s, Devil May Cry, an action game set in Europe and inspired by Baroque architecture and medieval aesthetics. Kamiya was the action king, and what really made Devil May Cry special was not its frankly pretty basic story, or even necessarily the setting, but the mechanics, which made fighting feel so stylish and even effortless once you mastered it. The same is true for his other big project before Ōkami, the side-scrolling beat-em-up Beautiful Joe. This is a game that is practically 100% flashy combat sections. Even the puzzles generally involve punching and kicking things. And the story? It's fun, sure, but it's also incredibly simple. More like a parody of an action movie script than an attempt to say anything profoundly emotional. Both of these games were quite successful, both abroad and at home. And the fact that Devil May Cry was faux European and Beautiful Joe was faux American didn't stand in the way of that. If anything, it helped. Japanese gamers in the mid-2000s didn't think ukiyo-e drawings and Edo-era decorations were cool. They were something your grandpa might talk about. Hollywood and Western-style science fiction were the trendy influences of the time. Just like in the late 19th century, to be an advocate of traditional Japanese culture was to be hopelessly behind the times. The future was international and Western. By being so Japan-centric, it's quite likely that Ōkami's visual presentation actually disappointed a lot of Kamiya's die-hard fans. And the same has to be said for its gameplay. I love this game's mechanics, and even I will admit that some sections are downright tedious. Remember when I mentioned before that Amaterasu and Susanoo defeat Orochi by using the same doubling technique they practiced on the rock? Yeah, that part of the game feels great from a story standpoint, but in terms of gameplay, it's a series of 8 QuickTime events, and finicky QuickTime events at that. It doesn't help to immerse you in a story when you fail the same cutscene half a dozen times, and instead of moving on, the game just keeps rubbing your nose in it until you finally succeed. It's a pain. There's entire dungeons that have more bad in them than good, my least favorite being the Waku Shrine near the end of the game. I think the good more than makes up for the bad most of the time, but I'd be lying if I told you that Ōkami never frustrated me and made me want to quit. And then there's the combat. Ōkami is much less combat-centric than Kamiya's other games, which is a mark against it right off the bat for some people. But also, I don't know, the combat here is just a little shallower than it is in Kamiya's other games. I still think it has a higher than average skill ceiling, and some of the Celestial Brush moves have cool effects on enemies, but a lot of fights do eventually come down to button mashing, especially if you use the rosary weapons, which I do, God knows why. And finally, there's just the issue of getting around the overworld. Playing as a wolf instead of a person can be awkward and uncomfortable in ways you may not expect. Just look at the way Amaterasu runs and jumps totally unlike a character with 2 legs, or how often you have to pick up a key and carry it somewhere without getting hit because Amaterasu doesn't have pockets. The Legend of Zelda: Twilight Princess was another game that came out in 2006 where you play as a wolf for long periods, and these are often considered the absolute worst parts of the game, even by people who love the Zelda series. Now imagine a game where you only play as the wolf, the Zelda elements are much subtler and obscured by other mechanics, and the game can't coast off of brand recognition because it's the first one in the series. Kind of sounds like a disaster, right? Well, that's what Ōkami is. Clover Studio didn't create many games, so it's difficult to say what a typical Clover game would be, but based on what its big names have done since the team folded, Ōkami, with its heavy story focus, relatively underdesigned combat, and traditional Japanese aesthetic, isn't it. Ōkami was a big swing away from the comfort zone for practically everyone involved with it, especially director/writer Hideki Kamiya, who has really never attempted anything this ambitious or risky ever since. The lone wolf decided that he was better off joining the rest of the pack, and who can blame him? We all have to get by in this life, and making games with great stories that are critically acclaimed for how artsy they are, but don't make any money, is a lot harder than making games like Devil May Cry or Bayonetta, where the critics just shrug at the story and presentation, but praise everything else, and people not only buy it, but sit on the edge of their seats waiting for the next one to come out. Auteurs aren't exempt from the laws of the marketplace. Just the same as your typical literary hack, they're really only as ambitious as their audiences encourage them to be. Perhaps more importantly, what their audiences reward them for being. Unless you're independently wealthy, or have a few very rich patrons who are each willing to take the place of hundreds of thousands of normal customers, you can't spend your whole career making whatever you want. You have to make something that the mainstream will want. And you have to be a good enough self-promoter to get people to look up from whatever else they're doing and see the good in your art. Not only that, you have to hope that the good things your art brings to the world will outweigh, for most people at least, the other things which they're almost certain to disagree with, or even consider morally wrong. Which brings us back, after quite a long time, to Wagner. When I compared Ōkami to a stage work like Lohengrin in the foreword to this video, that was partly because they had similar styles. Epic, stagey, full of symbolism, deliberately, I might even say aggressively, old-fashioned, and most of all, self-consciously different from what most other comparable productions were doing at the time. But another thing that struck me about these two works was the personalities of their creators. Obviously, Hideki Kamiya has never done anything that would get him in nearly as much trouble as Richard Wagner did during his lifetime, in either the get cancelled on Twitter sense or the run into debt and almost get thrown in jail sense. But Kamiya is known as a prickly, opinionated guy with a hair-trigger temper who gets into arguments with his fans. While he generally keeps things professional in professional contexts, on social media he shows himself to be easily angered and very quick to shut people out if they say things that annoy him, which he has thoughtfully compiled on Twitter in a list of rules for idiots. He may have never been cancelled, but his strong opinions and abrasive attitude have certainly burned a lot of bridges and forced major changes in his career trajectory on more than one occasion. It seems that recently he became too much even for fellow spirit Atsushi Inaba. About a year ago, he left Platinum Games, the studio that he co-founded with Inaba, after Ōkami's financial failure drove them out of Capcom, and it seems that this latest break also had to do with differences in creative vision. Among the general public, he's still virtually unknown, and a lot of the people who do know his name hate him, either for the way he behaves or for content in his games that they object to. But he also has a fairly large following of die-hard fans who consider him brilliant. Even more than that, really. They consider him one of the few game designers working today who really gets what makes games good and insists on it, never bowing down to the trends of the moment. Sound familiar? I sometimes think it's a shame that the people who make total works of art tend to be people who are so hard to like, iconoclasts who always fragment the audience and polarize every conversation they're involved in. But on the other hand, I have to wonder if people who are always nice, who don't insist on themselves and make compromises so that everyone can feel important and correct, are even capable of making a total work of art. In a way, doesn't a willingness to mix parts of your vision with parts of everybody else's vision indicate that what you have isn't really a vision at all? That you don't, in the most important sense, believe in your art? Making art according to nobody's standards but your own is a selfish thing to do. And if what you make doesn't resonate with those who experience it, you could be the nicest person on earth, and people would still be angry with you because you failed to live up to their standards. Since everyone is bound to fail every now and then, the only people who can make this kind of art and survive are those who aren't sensitive to public hatred and ridicule, either through temperament or an acquired resistance. So yeah, they tend to be jerks, because the ones who aren't jerks wither and die, and because having strong opinions is enough on its own to make you a jerk in some people's eyes. Total works of art aren't necessarily better than artworks made through a process of collaboration and compromise. Don Giovanni is an opera set in Spain, based on a book by a Spanish author, with music written by an Austrian composer set to Italian lyrics written by another guy who had lived all over Europe. But it's rightly considered to be one of the greatest operas ever made. Mozart could have written the libretto if he'd really wanted to. He did speak fluent Italian, but he didn't see the need. The music and lyrics may not have been written by the same person, but they work brilliantly together because both were written by like-minded professionals, one of whom was also a genius. But for all its good qualities, there's one thing that Don Giovanni conspicuously lacks: innovation. It's a polished example of traditional Italian opera that benefits from 2 centuries of refinement, but that very refinement dictates a certain predictable structure. It's full of things that are known crowd-pleasers: a wicked protagonist who gets his just desserts in the end, a clumsy, cringing servant to provide comic relief, young lovers who give the audience someone to root for, and hours of catchy music that you're certain to remember, whether or not you remember anything that anyone said over the course of the story. Richard Wagner may have been something of a bigot, both artistically and otherwise, but he didn't completely despise the work of previous composers. Actually, Wagner conducted a performance of Don Giovanni in Zurich the year after he finished Lohengrin. His problem with grand opera was that he felt it imitated earlier works in a stale, obvious way, rather than being inspired by them to do something new. I think Wagner's biggest artistic problem was that he allowed his own opinions, which were genuinely countercultural in the 1860s, to cement into a new kind of orthodoxy that his operatic disciples repeated uncritically for decades afterwards. Just as a Donizetti or a Bizet would look at something like Siegfried and laugh at Wagner's gauche insistence on doing everything himself, instead of focusing on what he was good at. And Rossini felt the need to comment that Wagner's operas had some beautiful moments, but terrible quarters of an hour. Wagner simply refused to see the good in any other way of writing operas than his own. His last big idea was to build his own opera house in the Bavarian town of Bayreuth, dedicated to staging his own works his way forever. Which didn't end up happening, incidentally. If anything, Bayreuth productions these days are notable for how wildly experimental they are, which is much more the spirit of the young, pre-Ring Wagner. I think Hideki Kamiya has the same problem. He's probably the closest thing to a genius auteur that the video game world has ever seen, and he has lots of great ideas. But he's reached the point in his career when he seems to care more about reviving his old ideas than coming up with new ones. Bayonetta is a great series, but it's also in many ways just a new kind of Devil May Cry, which isn't even that essential since Capcom is still making Devil May Cry games. I think Kamiya is an excellent writer when he has the right inspiration, but over the last decade and a half, he seems to have retreated from investing a lot of effort into a game's story, and to me, that's a crying shame. Despite any reservations I may have aired about its mechanics and certain sections of gameplay, Ōkami is still my favorite among the games that Hideki Kamiya has made, and possibly my favorite Capcom game, which is saying something. In some ways, I like it even better than the classic Zelda games which helped to inspire it. I simply can't think of a game which does a better job of embodying the culture of a single nation. And I know the team at Clover had an advantage in covering the country they grew up in, but dang, there's lots of other game designers from Japan, and none of them have made a game that is Japan. If you like Japanese history or art, you owe it to yourself to play Ōkami. If you don't know anything about Japan, then you should play it too, to get a crash course on what you've been missing all this time. And if you hate Japan, it might be because you got blocked on Twitter by Hideki Kamiya for tweeting him in English, which I get, but don't take it out on a whole country, man.